We just watched a great video on using quotes in your news reports, but there are a few other things I want to highlight, as I found some of my students struggle with quotes and attributions. To better prepare you for your writing assignments, we'll first give an overview on the types of quotes, talk about when it's okay to edit a quote, learn how to introduce quotes in a story, discuss quote punctuation, and finally, understand attributions and how to identify your sources. Direct quotes are a verbatim translation of your source's words, mostly. We'll talk about editing quotes in just a minute. Now, here's an example of a source's direct words. The quote is a little wordy, so a better option might be a paraphrase. A paraphrase is what a source said, but doesn't use the source's exact words. Now, this example paraphrase still presents the same information, but uses tighter writing. A partial quote, meanwhile, is exactly what it sounds like, part of a quote. Now, as demonstrated in these examples, partial quotes typically don't work as well as either a direct quote or a paraphrase, and should be used sparingly. While quotes should always be what a source said, they don't always have to be exactly how it was said. Now, quotes can be edited for verbal fillers, the like, you know, and other words that we subconsciously insert into our sentences that don't change the overall meaning. Now, maybe this is what our source actually said. Now, printing this quote verbatim makes our source seem a little dumb. So it's okay to edit, again, as long as your edits don't change the overall meaning. Now, if he was writing this out, he wouldn't say like, you know. So those things are things that it's okay to edit. Again, as long as the edits don't change the overall meaning. Beyond verbal fillers, quotes can also be edited for length. Now, here is a tighter version of what our source said. If you're going to take out words, though, use ellipses, these 3 little dots here, to indicate that you've intentionally omitted part of the original quote. Again, as long as you don't alter the original meaning of that quote. And quotes can be edited for clarity. Now, let's assume that your source told you that the we he refers to in his quote is himself and the program's executive director. Now, if you wanted to indicate in that quote who that executive director was, who the we was, you would use brackets to indicate that your source said he and executive director Shaquilla Tyler, but not in those exact words. Again, one more time, only do so if it doesn't alter the original meaning of the quote. Something journalism students often have trouble with is introducing quotes. Now, the best way to introduce a quote is to summarize what the quote will say, but without repeating the words from the quote itself. For example, Kali has had enough. I've had enough, Kali said. That's just wasting words, since you're saying the same things twice. Now, a better way to introduce the quote is, for Kali, the end can't come too soon. I've had enough, Kali said. Now that introduction sets up the quote without stating the obvious or repeating information. Novice journalists tend to introduce quotes poorly, using leads such as, in interviewing, in my interview with, in speaking with, when asked what she thought of, and I asked his opinion. None of these phrases should show up in any of your articles. First, your reader knows you conducted an interview with the source. That's what journalists do, conduct interviews. Now, if it wasn't you that interviewed the source, you would indicate that using language such as Kern told WRAL News. Now, second, it inserts you as the journalist into the story. Unless you're writing an opinion piece, it's the journalist's job to stay out of the story. Finally, it's a really lazy way to introduce a quote and shows readers that the journalist doesn't have enough training. Now for a little quote punctuation. Commas go inside the quotation marks, like in this example here. Like commas, periods go inside the quotation marks, which we can see in this example here. If you have a multiple sentence quote, the attribution goes at the end of the first sentence, as seen in these examples. When you are quoting someone else, put the inside quote in single quotation marks, like in this example. Now, you might end up in a situation where you have a single quotation mark right next to double quotation marks. It might look a little funny, but that's okay. Attribution is telling your readers where you got your information, be it from a human source, a report, another news outlet, or a video. Now, NPR, the radio news network, their philosophy is to attribute everything, as they want their audience to know what information came from what source. Now, that's a good rule, but writing so-and-so said after every sentence can be a bit much for the reader. A better guideline is offered by journalist Tony Rogers. Attribute once per paragraph. Any information that comes from a source rather than your own first-hand observation or knowledge. And just like in writing a research paper, though, you don't need to cite common knowledge or clear and undisputed facts, like North Carolina became a state in 1789. Speaking of sources, how should you identify them in your story? Identify your source using both first and last name, along with some other identifying characteristics, such as job title or residence, such as Clifton Robinson, a first grade teacher at Adams Elementary. Use the source's last name only on subsequent reference. There are only 14 students in Robinson's classroom today, with more than half homesick with the flu. Now, don't reference Robinson by his first name unless he's under the age of 18. Don't use courtesy titles like Mr., Mrs., or Ms. in attributions. Using Mr. Robinson here is incorrect. It's just Robinson. There are, however, a few exceptions that allow you to use courtesy titles, such as in direct quotations. If someone said, Mr. Robinson is my favorite teacher, you don't have to edit out the Mr. And also, you use courtesy titles for medical doctors and dentists, Dr. Clifton Robinson on first reference and Dr. Robinson on subsequent references. Sometimes you will have a story where sources share a last name, such as a husband and wife or parent and child. In those instances, you want to do what the New York Times does and use the source's full name on each reference, rather than courtesy titles or first name on subsequent references, such as Clifton Robinson and Claire Robinson, rather than Mr. Robinson and Mrs. Robinson or Clifton and Claire. Now, you may run across a source who identifies outside the male-female gender binary and uses they, them, or other pronouns instead of he, him, or she, her. Now, when this happens, you can do one of three things. Now, in this quote, if Jameson is going to show up a bunch in this story, you might want to let the reader know that you'll be using they said later on. Now, in this fictional example of a local store staying open a little bit later, Jameson is just a pleased patron, so that probably wouldn't be necessary. Now, your second option is just drop in they said with no explanation. Now, that might work, but you can also run the risk of readers thinking you made a typo or draw attention to Jameson's gender when it isn't really relevant to the story. Now, in this particular instance, I would recommend avoiding the issue altogether and just use their last name again rather than a pronoun.